One of the biggest reveals we got in What If Season 1 was when the Ancient One talked about absolute points with Doctor Strange.
Her death is an absolute point in time.
So imagine my surprise when in X-Men 97 Episode 8 talks about absolute points again when Cable shows up in their current timeline.
Speak of absolute points, events that occur across all timelines.
So I've been thinking about absolute points a lot, and I realized that there have been many absolute points in the MCU that have shaped the story in more ways than one. In truth, the entire main line of the 616 was an absolute point. But through it all, I wonder, is there a way to stop an absolute point without the destruction of your universe? The answer is yes, and it's all thanks to Loki. But also, how exactly are absolute points, Nexus events, and Canon events all connected? So get your time stones and your TemPads ready, guys. We're going to be telling you what you need to know about absolute points. Welcome to Keepin' the Comic, and I'm your host, GoofyRhexxi. So what exactly is an absolute point, and why in the world is it so important? Well, from what I can gather, absolute points are events in the Marvel Universe that absolutely have to happen because it is a fixed point in time. And the consequences of the events compel characters to make certain decisions or certain actions that are crucial for their story and the story of their overall universe. These absolute points are selected because of their significance to their timelines and the lives of certain individuals. Also, the idea of absolute points represents the rules and limitations for time travel in the Marvel Universe. An example of an absolute point in the MCU would be Doctor Strange losing Christine Palmer, as we saw in What If Season 1, Episode 4, which led him down the path of seeking a life in the mystic arts, which ultimately turned him into the sorcerer superhero. That is not what we see in our main 616 universe. For us, Doctor Strange lost his hands in a similar accident that had the same results. As we saw in What If, when an absolute point is broken, it destroys a universe with sorcerer doctors yelling out, in the end. Now, absolute points are not to be mistaken for Nexus events in Loki, which arise as a result of someone doing something they weren't supposed to do in the sacred timeline, resulting in the creation of a new timeline or reality, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. But before that, I also think it's important to note that absolute points are not the same thing as canon events from across the Spider-Verse. Now, I know on paper that they are the same thing, kinda, so let's discuss the similarities first. Absolute points are events that are supposed to happen in a story, and if they're changed, it causes the destruction of a universe. Canon events are events that are supposed to happen in the lives and stories of Spider-Man, and if they're changed, it causes the destruction of a universe. And if you even look at the consequences, from both What If Episode 4 and Spider-Man, they're identical. We see a black smudge eroding Strange Supreme's universe as it gets destroyed. We see the same similar black smudge in Mumbattan after Miles saves the Captain. Even the attempted methods of corrections are the same. Doctor Strange shoots beams of energy that produce red prism-like lines that attempt to contain the spread of the black smudge. The Spider Society projects similar red prism-like lines to contain the deterioration of the universe. So does that mean that they're the same thing? Well, not exactly. First of all, canon events are mainly linked to Spider-Man, and second of all, canon events are easily broken. Say what you will about absolute points, but they're not something that you can easily break. Doctor Strange went through a bunch of scenarios, and in every scenario, Christine Palmer dies. The guy had to lock himself for centuries, absorbing all the powers of magical creatures and absorbing his other half before he was able to break the absolute point. The same thing happens with Cable in the Genosha Massacre. Cable stated that no matter what he does to stop the genocide, time pulls him back, hence absolute points cannot easily be broken. Now, canon events, on the other hand, are the complete opposite. I mean, the only opposition that Miles had to save the Captain was Gwen holding him back, which he easily shrugged off. And just like that, the canon event was toast. Cue the black smudge. Same thing with Miguel O'Hara. All he had to do to break his canon event was to enter the life of his counterpart after his death, and boom, canon event was broken. Cue the black smudge. So you see, absolute points in canon events do have differences, but for the most part, their consequences seem to be the same. The canceling out of an absolute point or a canon event can cause the destruction of a universe. And this might not seem like a big deal to you, but as we explained earlier in this channel, when a universe gets destroyed, it can cause what's known as an incursion. This means the destruction of an absolute point can potentially destroy the entire multiverse. If you're confused about that, check out our video here on incursions and how Deadpool 3 or Deadpool and Wolverine is going to cause the incursions leading to Secret Wars. It's a great video to watch, I promise you. Now, we here at Keepin' It Comic are working around the clock to bring out some wild theories from comics and comic-related media, so be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on a new video. Now, as we jump back to absolute points, here's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. When you look at how absolute points have affected the MCU, you'll be pretty astonished. I critically looked at the possible absolute points in a universe, and it's a little crazy. Now, I know a lot of us will be quick to claim any significant event in the MCU as an absolute point, but remember, we have to look at things from an inevitability standpoint, not just significance. One obvious absolute point would be Thanos snapping his fingers, which, according to Doctor Strange, happens over 14 million times. No wonder Thanos said,
I am inevitable.
Time heist is also another example of an inevitable event, because according to Ravonna Renslayer in Loki episode 1, that was supposed to happen. It's an inevitable occurrence. Same thing with Tony Stark's death. Like Doctor Strange said in Endgame with his ever descriptive hand gestures, there's only one way. Tony has to give his life. It is inevitable, and if Tony hadn't, well, the universe would have actually been destroyed. I just cannot make this up. Wanda becoming the Scarlet Witch was also an absolute point. It was written in the Darkhold and on the walls of Wangador that no matter how you look at it, Wanda must become the Scarlet Witch. It's an inevitable occurrence. I also think that Peter losing Gamora is an absolute point as well, because he and her are destined to never be together. It's an inevitable fact, one that is really sad but happens anyways. Gamora was meant to die so that Thanos could save the Soul Stone, and even when she came back through time travel like Doctor Strange did in What If, she and Quill could still not be together. It's an obscure absolute point, but I think it holds true no matter how you look at it. Quill will never be with Gamora. It's inevitable. If he had somehow ended up with her, then Guardians of the Galaxy 3 might have happened differently, and who knows what dire consequences might have occurred. But hey, those aren't the only absolute points in the MCU, because when I think about it, there's a series in the MCU that's entirely dedicated to absolute points. That's right, Marvel's What If is actually a series about absolute points. What If shows us events that are inevitable across the multiverse. Like from episode 1, Captain Carter takes the super soldier serum instead of Steve Rogers. That is an absolute point in the sense that someone must take the super soldier serum. No matter how you look at it, it's inevitable. If you were to remove an event from happening, that entire universe gets destroyed because that war would have lacked a captain. Yes, the consequences in both wars are different, but the absolute points are the same. The same thing in What If episode 2. The absolute point that Yondu is taking a kid from Earth, it's an absolute, cannot be changed. It must happen. We even see it in What If season 2. Yondu still takes Peter Quill, but he gives him to Ego this time. Tony Stark creating Ultron, that's an absolute point. Is Hank Pym going to the quantum realm to rescue his wife? That's an absolute point. What If gives us insight on absolute points because it's literally a series detailing what the absolute points are in the MCU. But is that it though? Do we just accept the absolute points and call it a day? Is there nothing we can do to change the status quo? Because believe it or not, absolute points and canon events aren't the best things for our heroes. For a lot of them, it's the source of their pain and trauma. I mean, Cable lost his mom in the Genosha genocide. Thanos snap erased half the universe, and that caused pain and suffering for a lot of people. Sure, they came back, but all of that pain and hurt doesn't just go away. When Wanda became the Scarlet Witch, she murdered a ton of people in Carmitage and killed almost all the members of the Illuminati. And don't even get me started on the Genosha genocide. To me, an absolute point in canon events are deterministic plot pieces that mostly bring pain and suffering to people. That's why Miles doesn't want to accept his father's death if he can do something about it. That's why Sylvie wants to destroy the TVA, because the sacred timeline is just one big absolute point thanks to He Who Remains. I mean, really, think about it. The sacred timeline is a series of events that are supposed to happen. They have to be unchanging and must remain the same, otherwise the universe will get destroyed. There's no freedom, no room for carving out your own path. The absolute points dictate that everyone must follow an already predetermined script for the universe to keep it functioning. It's the classic story of free will and determinism. That's why Lokis are always getting pruned, because Loki exists to break the status quo. It's why Miles is a threat to the very fabric of Spider Society, because he doesn't believe in sticking to a script. So, is there a way to safely break an absolute point that doesn't destroy your universe or your multiverse? The answer is kinda. And it all has to do with Nexus events. We've already established that absolute points are unchanging and they are inevitable. So if you do manage to break them, it will result in the destruction of your universe. So you can't really change an absolute point, but what you can change is how you respond to it. Let me explain. In What If Episode 4, Christine Palmer has to die, right? Yes, that's the absolute point. It's unchanging. But what happens after that can be changed. However unlikely it may be, Strange doesn't have to be the sorcerer after Christine's death. He could just mourn her loss and eventually move on. And by doing so, he'll never have to become a sorcerer. By making that choice, Doctor Strange would have created a whole new timeline. He would have essentially created a Nexus event. And there's no telling what happens in that universe as things progress. The same thing with Cable. Although he cannot stop the Genosha genocide, which leads to Bastion taking over the world, what he can do is stop Bastion after the Genosha genocide, and by doing so, he changes the story. An absolute point can't be changed, but the consequences after the absolute point are fair game. If you already know what's going to happen, you can rig the system to favor you after the event. If any of them had done this under the He Who Remains regime, the TVA would have swooped in and pruned him because they would be creating an alternate timeline. But thanks to Loki, that's no longer the case. People are free to make their own choices despite the absolute points in their path. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to end all hunky-dory as you desire it to, because yeah, we got Loki holding all the multiverse together with the Yggdrasil tree and all that, but be warned, the consequences of your actions could be good and it could be bad, but at the end of the day, you can take pride in knowing that you made the choice yourself despite the multiverse forcing an absolute point on you. Because as we saw in certain things like the Spider-Verse, because Miles Morales broke canon, now there's a universe without Spider-Man, and of course, we already see what that universe looks like. So we're gonna have to stay tuned here to see what happens in the MCU when people start breaking those absolute points, because I think that this is gonna be a big key thing leading up to Secret Wars that we're gonna have to see play out here. So I guess What If is a series about absolute points and Nexus events that has worked out here in the MCU. What are your thoughts on this theory here? What do you think about absolute points in the MCU? Do you think that they should be broken? Leave it down below in the comments. Also, let me know what other events you think would be absolute points here in the MCU. Like and subscribe to the channel for more. As usual, it's been a pleasure. I am your host, GoofyRhexxi. Thank you so much for kicking it with Keepin' It Comic.